A very warm welcome indeed to all of you to this session on blended peatland finance at the Peatland Pavilion at COP26. My name is Mark Reed and I'll be chairing today's session. And as you can see, we are honoured to have speakers from across Europe sharing their insights and experiences. We're going to be hearing about the international experience of the Landscape Finance Lab, who are represented by Paul Chatterton. He'll be co-presenting with Deirdre Lynn from Ireland's National Parks and Wildlife Service to hear about how they're working together to blend public and private finance. Then we're going to be moving closer to home to hear how Peatland Action in Scotland are designing future public schemes to interface with carbon finance via the Peatland Code. So we'll be hearing from Renee Kirkfleet-Hermans and Peter Hutchinson. Finally, we're going to hear from Neil O'Brolacon about EU-funded work to develop peatland eco-credits for Northwest Europe, with the goal of developing a system that could work across Europe. And then we're going to conclude with a panel discussion. So if you're online, please add your questions into the Q&A box. There is a microphone in the pavilion to take your questions. And if you're online, you can upvote those questions to get the ones to the top that you most want to get an answer to. But before we dive into all of this, I'm going to start the session with an overview of what we're talking about when we talk about blended finance and some of the mechanisms that are available to us. So a little bit more about me, and each of our presenters will say a little bit more about themselves as they start. But I am director of the Thriving Natural Capital Challenge Centre at Scotland's Rural College. I'm research lead for the IUCN UK Peatland programme, where I work with Renee from this session, and co-chair with Diana Kapansky of the UNEP Global Peatlands Initiative Research Working Group. Now, why should we be blending public and private finance? First, I think that for me, this is about getting better value and more impact from public money when you blend with private finance. High integrity environmental markets can pay for many of the outcomes that are currently being funded by agri-environment schemes. And that can free up public funds to prioritise habitats, ecosystem services, and community benefits that are valued by society, but that the market would fail to deliver. Second, blending can increase the amount of funding available, so we speed up a just transition to net zero. Without blending, public schemes can crowd out private investment if payment rates or terms are more attractive. As long as there is uncertainty about how public and private schemes interact, farmers are less likely to enter either. By taking pressure off public funds, it's also possible to use public funding to ensure then that we've got tangible benefits for rural communities. Third and finally, coordinating payments can reduce trade-offs between ecosystem services and deliver additional benefits. Without blending, there's a danger that schemes paying for one outcome, say climate change mitigation, may do so at the expense of other outcomes, so for example, biodiversity. But by coordinating payments across multiple public and private schemes, it's possible to anticipate and avoid trade-offs and achieve landscape scale win-wins. Now, there are barriers to doing this successfully, and we'll hear much more about the complexity of this in real life in this session. The first of these issues is complexity. The number of carbon codes, ecosystem markets, and green finance mechanisms is proliferating rapidly. A whole load of them launched this week at COP. And this is confusing, obviously, if you're a land manager, advisor, or even as an investor. But there are ways to simplify things. For example, we now have a UK land carbon registry where all domestic carbon units from woodlands and peatlands are integrated, and future units from agricultural soil carbon, salt marsh, etc. are going to be sold. I have set up a policy coordination group in the UK. It's now chaired by JNCC. And the job of this group is to horizon scan, to share good practice, and consider regulatory options to harmonise policy across UK countries. So, for example, we're now trying to avoid the scenario where the Scottish government pays a higher proportion of peatland code project costs than, say, the English government, reducing the price per tonne of carbon, and then effectively outcompeting England and getting all of the private investment into Scotland. Finally, I've been working with landscape enterprise networks as a model that can integrate private funding streams with public funding options for land managers in a single, simple menu of options that's coordinated across a landscape. Of course, the alternative is for governments to do this, integration via agri-environment schemes that integrate private finance options, or via privately or publicly funded advisors who might help managers to navigate this complexity. The second issue is that there may be insufficient flows of private finance to blend meaningfully with public funds. Now, as I said in the session this morning, there's currently more demand than we can supply in the Peatland Code in the UK, but that's not the case everywhere. So high integrity environmental markets are needed to provide investors with confidence. And a range of international and domestic voluntary carbon markets are now emerging, accredited to ISO and other relevant standards, alongside ecosystem markets for, say, water quality, flood risk alleviation, biodiversity, and schemes designed to reduce risks to infrastructure and supply chains from climate change. If you aren't happy with the options available on international voluntary carbon markets, in which it can be expensive to register, validate and verify projects, we'll hear a bit more from Neil about this later on, then it is possible to develop domestic schemes, such as the Peatland Code in the UK, which you can see on the screen here. So there are barriers, but as you can see, there are ways of overcoming these barriers. And this is very much work in progress. So next I want to get to the heart of my talk. No, here we go, the wrong page. So yeah, there are barriers, and we're still on the barriers. If we're going to get the right kind of pipelines of projects, if we're going to have both demand and supply, then we need to overcome some of the challenges that we're seeing across the world, but in particular in the UK. I was talking this morning about some of the concerns we're hearing expressed about the kinds of economic models that are being used by certain brokers, farmers wanting to be sure that they are getting a good, a fair, transparent score for carbon, and that someone else isn't running off with all of the profit. Concerns around just the certainty of public messaging from governments around what will happen to your eligibility for public schemes if you sign up for, say, the Peatland Code. And of course, risks, whether actual or perceived. And of course, messaging can play a role around perceived risks. We need to have a real think about that. A lot of social science being done in the UK to try and work out how we can encourage people to take what are actually often much less lower risks than they expect and engage with peatland carbon markets. So I'm not going to go into any more on that because I talked about that earlier on this morning. So I want to get to the heart of my talk at this point and to think about how we might be able to blend these different types of finance. And here I'm drawing on research that I've led in press in the journal PLOS One, and work by 3Keel, the Green Alliance and the National Trust in Cumbria as part of a DEFRA-funded test and trial project. Broadly speaking, there are three approaches and a variety of different mechanisms that we can use. So first, there is a full public-private co-procurement of public goods, integrating public and private finance into a single fund at a landscape scale designed to deliver multiple outcomes. Now, landscape enterprise networks, or LENS, are already co-procuring public goods from multiple private investors and could easily be expanded to include co-investment from agri-environment schemes. LENS, as you can see on the screen here, is a model for delivering private investment in ecosystem services, enabling financial flows through what's described as green commerce, instead of overloading landscapes with unnecessary debt-based financial instruments. To do this, it identifies and prioritizes landscape challenges and assets, and identifies corporate actors who are affected by these challenges or that depend upon or benefit from these ecosystem assets. So, for example, water quality or flood risk alleviation or carbon sequestration. Lens then provides a framework for multiple organizations to co-procure landscape outcomes from land managers, who are then the suppliers of ecosystem services, paying farmers a fair price for the services they provide, whilst reducing risks and procuring benefits for the investors. The second of these three blending options is coordinated public-private funding of public goods. These are then delineated in space and time. So we've got certain areas or application windows for private markets versus public schemes. And the idea here is that we're trying to enable the market to pay for as much as possible, while public payments then focus on market failures and those who are not prepared to accept private finance. Oh, there we go. That was what I was talking about. And as you can see, the whole range of different mechanisms that we can use to do that. I've alluded to funds delineation already. We could use carbon trigger funds, where you have to get to a certain level of private investment before you trigger the rest of a public grant. And I'll talk briefly about carbon floor price guarantees in a moment. The business as usual option is where private funding pays for services that are not being procured by public funding with limited coordination. So the primary mechanism here is the additionality criteria that already exist in carbon codes like the Peatland Code that enable public funding of schemes up to a certain amount. So 85% in both the Woodland Carbon Code and the Peatland Code in the UK, you have to have at least 15% carbon finance for this to be considered additional. So I want to have a slightly deeper think about these three options and think about the advantages and disadvantages of each. I think the key advantages of full public-private co-procurement of public goods are, first of all, that it offers a single mechanism with options for both public and private finance. So it's quite simple for land managers to deal with. It can help identify trade-offs between ecosystem services particularly effectively, and risks are shared between multiple private sector and public investors. And finally, it's a place-based approach. So it's adapted to local contexts and priorities and has the potential to feed into regional economic and community development. There are, of course, some disadvantages. So first of all, it can potentially present some additionality issues for funding via carbon codes, such as the Peatland Code. Now, although the place-based approach is its strength, I think the issue here is that because it's operating at a landscape scale, replicating this then and adapting to each new context is much more challenging and time-consuming. And finally, attributing outcomes to funders is more complex, and there may be challenges in terms of WTO rules on what public funding can and can't pay for in agriculture. Next, I want to think about coordinated public-private funding for public goods, this second model of blending. Both this model and the previous model are really economically efficient compared to the current system that we've got for both public and private buyers, and both models avoid risks of public funding crowding out private finance. Specific advantages of the coordinated model are that you can design and operate a blended scheme nationally with relative ease compared to this full co-procurement model operating at the landscape scale. It's compatible with the additionality criteria in domestic carbon markets, and it's easier to identify who pays for what. However, it's harder to identify and avoid trade-offs between ecosystem services and adapt schemes to local contexts and priorities. Scheme design itself and governance can be more complex depending on the mechanism, and land managers may find the range of carbon and ecosystem markets available confusing. And this last point is also an issue in the current business as usual model. The main advantage of the current system, of course, is that the majority of funding is from public sources using mechanisms that are familiar to land managers. So this reduces the perceived risk and probably risk as well. Limited changes needed to government schemes as they currently exist, but it's less economically efficient as it doesn't really leverage or fully exploit market potential. There's a danger that public funding crowds out private finance, And there's the potential for trade-offs between ecosystem services funded by private markets and public schemes. So I'd like to conclude by giving you an example of what this might look like. And my colleagues and I are exploring this very example, in fact, with colleagues, policy colleagues in different parts of the UK. I'll start with the idea of funds delineation in time. So you open an application window for private funding before applications open for public funding to increase the likelihood that as many projects as possible are funded privately first. In this case, I'm going to open applications for private funding via a Peatland carbon guarantee. So in this model, landowners put together peatland code projects and enter them into a reverse auction, with the lowest credible bids being funded until the scheme is full and ensuring good value for money. A private finance facility could then be made available to projects to cover capital works to restore peatlands, essentially offering loans to be paid back over the project's duration. And so landowners would factor these repayments into their bids into the reverse auction. As verification points are reached and verified carbon units are generated, landowners can then sell to the government at the guaranteed floor price, or they can sell into the carbon market if higher prices are available there. So in the best case scenario, carbon markets increase in value rapidly enough that none of the projects uses the guarantee, and the government doesn't have to spend a penny. It can reinvest that money back into future guarantees. In locations where a place-based approach is being applied, so for example, there is a landscape enterprise network, or if in Scotland we've got pilot rural land use partnerships, then supply aggregators will identify peatlands in their region to coordinate applications to the guarantee within that application window, with funding then being integrated with this for related outcomes, for example, downstream water quality for a water company investor. And then finally, applications are going to open for public peatlands restoration funding, targeting those who A, don't want private funding, or B, whose bids weren't accepted under the guarantee mechanism, where restoration is expensive per tonne of carbon, probably the main reason you're not going to win in that auction, but crucially where there are significant public benefits, for example, biodiversity. So in conclusion, I hope that this example, although a little bit hypothetical, we're going to get some real life examples coming next, but trying to give you a sense of what blending might look like in practice for peatland restoration using these three different types of mechanism. Compared to the current uncoordinated approach, the blending options I've outlined in this talk have the potential to increase there we go, we have some slides to go with this. So compared with the current uncoordinated approach, the blending options I've outlined in this talk have the potential to increase the efficiency of public investment in peatland restoration. They can increase the amounts of funding available overall for public restoration, and finally contribute towards a more just transition for peatland communities. I'm going to conclude. If you want to get access to our +1 paper or the report that came out of that DEFRA test and trial, or a load of other things on my website, this project website, in fact, Resilient Dairy Landscapes, or email me. We're going to have questions at the end in our panel discussion, so I'll allow you to put those into the chat, into the Q&A box if you're online. And there's a mechanism for doing that in the room. At this point, I'd like to hand over to Paul Chatterton from the Landscape Finance Lab and Deirdre Lynn from Ireland's National Parks and Wildlife Service. And let's hear a bit more about how you're working together to blend public and private finance in Ireland. That we'll hear from Paul well beyond Ireland as well. Over to you, Paul.
Let me start by unmuting. Thanks, Mark. That was a great introduction, a great talk. And hello, Peatlanders. Very good to be with you. It's a real honour to be here. I run the Landscape Finance Lab, which is a new organization that's just spun out of the conservation organization WWF. We focus on helping to incubate and finance sustainable landscapes around the planet. I want to talk about landscape finance and how peatlands fits into that. There's a whole world of work going on in financing different types of landscape programs, and I think there's some interesting innovations and experiments that can help strengthen what's happening in the peatland world. And I'm very impressed, I must say, Mark, with what's now happening in the peatland world that can help inform the rest of the world as well. So let me try to there we go. So why landscapes? The world's conservation organizations have really retooled around the landscape approach. And I think that's now being supported by business increasingly and government. And the reason is that it takes you to another scale. It's the scale at which nature works. As Mark said, it gives you the ability to work across different sectors and to integrate actions to achieve both synergy across those different actions, but also to draw in more finance. And I'll talk a bit about some of the potential for financing from the private sector that can contribute to the public sector. And hopefully, as a result of that, we have much greater impact. So the Little Sustainable Landscape book that a few of us wrote and launched at a COP back in 2015, the Paris COP, was a very important document where we looked at the landscape approach as it applied across as many sectors as we can find. And interestingly, the peatland sector didn't come up at that stage. But we found that climate smart agriculture in the food sector, integrated catchment management in the water sector, renewable energy provinces, there was landscape approaches going on in almost all of the sectors we looked at. And while they were working on different content areas, they had pretty much a common strategy. And in that book, we tried to boil it down to 5 simple steps by which you can build a landscape program. Now, there's been quite a bit of development since then on the landscape approach, and more recent publication that we launched at the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration back in June for Returns Framework gives us a methodology for building landscape programs over a generational framework, going through 5 simple steps that build the landscape program. So it starts with a partnership, bringing key stakeholders together to then understand what's happening in the landscape, define the core problem to be addressed and build an action plan, take action and learn. It's just the project approach really, but driven by the stakeholders in the landscape, a zoning system, and then a focus on very clear SDG goals, the 4 returns we call them. But importantly, the first return, the return of inspiration we're finding, is what's driving forward the landscape approach. As people come to see that hope can return in their landscape for addressing a core problem, it brings people together. That's a little bit on the theory of the landscape approach. Finance is a very interesting world, because what we've also appreciated, and Mark is alluding to this, is that there's a whole lot of money out there that can apply to landscapes. It's not being drawn down. This graph is a picture of world finance flows annually, about $200 trillion that flows around the planet. And the current funding for peatlands is largely coming from these red boxes down in the bottom right. Government funding, global ODA, philanthropic money, conservation organizations. Now, it's tiny. There's all of this money that should be accessible for peatland solutions. How do we draw that down? How do we access that? The world of green bonds, oops, let me go back, sorry. The world of green bonds gives us a bit of a picture of what might be possible. Back a decade ago, there were only $2 billion worth of green bonds. It sounds like a lot, but within the framework of 200 trillion, it's a drop. Now, today, there's $1.3 trillion worth of green bonds in this universe. And just this year, there's been another $350 billion worth of bonds. Now, bond is just simply a collection of loans. So banks put together a collection of loans into a package, and they sell that package as a bond. Green bonds are ones that help achieve climate and sustainability goals. A few years ago, money for land use, for peatlands and other forms of forest, agriculture, water protection, amounted to about 1% of the total green bond universe. Today, we're up to 14%. And what that means is that there's a lot of bankers out looking for projects to invest in that involve land use and potentially peatlands. Now, the problem is that the bankers don't get out of bed unless you're talking $50 to $100 million, euro, pounds. So how do you build a program that can meet this sort of scale, that can meet bond scale? Let me give you a couple of examples of the types of landscape finance programs that are developing around the world. And this is categories of activities. The left is the world of forest carbon, RED, jurisdictional RED. And that's been going for many years. This is a project in the Democratic Republic of Congo that I helped to develop over a decade. It's taken a long time to build, but it secures 29 million tons of emission reductions. That's about the size of Cape Town. It saves forest equivalent to the size of Greece. It secures the half the habitat of the bonobo chimp, the animal closest to human beings. And importantly, it brings $170 million of carbon finance into a very poor province of DRC. Now, there's a lot of lessons in jurisdictional program design that I think can apply to peatland development, and we can come back to those. On the right-hand side is corporate action, landscape sourcing, we call it, for sustainability in a landscape, sustainable production and protection of natural areas. This is a project in Sumatra led by Michelin Tire Company. We helped in the design of it. It's now a $215 million purely commercial investment in sustainable rubber, forest restoration, and an improvement of a protected area. It's quite revolutionary. That doesn't have a carbon element to it, and it could have as another layer in it. But it's a good example of where corporates can take the lead in developing large solutions for natural ecosystems. On the left-hand side is an exciting program in Fiji to secure the reefs of Fiji. They're one of the few reefs that are going to survive climate change. Land-based runoff are really threatening them. So how to change that? And it's very much a small business solution that's being applied here. It's a lot of Matanataki is an incubator for small businesses that can help reef resilience. So they've got a $50 million investment, incubation and investment target. They've looked at 120 businesses across Fiji. There's 10 that are now investment ready, and they're getting their first investment into the first ones, which is purchasing waste dumps and turning them into recycling centres. There's other projects such as coral reef, replanting, ecotourism, organic agriculture, and so on. But that's very much a small business solution to landscapes and blended finance. And then on the right-hand side is a project that we're looking at with Rene, who you'll hear from soon, in the Flow Country in the very north of Scotland, where we're looking at how to apply a jurisdictional approach to peatland protection across 400,000 hectares. This area contains twice the amount of carbon as all of the forests of the UK combined. So it's incredibly important that it doesn't suffer as climate change dries out these sorts of areas, because there'll be very significant emissions coming from it. And we'll hear from Deirdre Lynn from National Parks Ireland about a similar model in Ireland in a minute. So just to conclude, the theory behind landscape level design, as we're now simplifying it to, is that you have a landscape, the stakeholders in that landscape define the core problem to address and the vision that they want to achieve. In the case of Fiji, it was securing the reefs for future generations and for the economy of Fiji. You then set a number of component targets, SDG targets that you want to achieve, and define projects that are, identify projects that are going to achieve these. Now, some of these might be commercial activities, timber production in the case of a peatland program, timber production, removal of timber off peatlands might be a commercial activity, polluted culture, ecotourism, and so on. But some of them will require grant funding, land tenure work, capacity building, and so on. So you mix these together and build pathways to achieve the larger results that can then deliver the vision. And that's the broad theory. So looking ahead, there's a whole set of challenges in making this work. It's a complex system, so training people up in it, simplifying the system, securing the initial design funds is still very tricky. There's a lot of finance that will come through these programs, but getting the early finance to design them is a challenge. And getting credible carbon investments of the sort that Mark is talking about. The voluntary market is still evolving. But I think there's some major opportunities. There's now very interesting discussions on multiple impact credits. So getting credits not only for carbon, but also for biodiversity, for water, for sustainable production. That's going to drive the whole market forward, in particular for peatlands. Banks are looking for portfolios that they can invest in. So this is really going up to another level. And once you've got that sort of scale of money coming into a landscape, how to maximize the ownership of the financial instruments and the finance flows in the landscape so that the local communities and the local businesses benefit. That's the key challenge. Anyway, there's a quick introduction to the world of landscape finance and how it might apply to peatlands. And with that, let me stop there and hand over to Deirdre Lynn.
Thank you. And thank you for inviting me to speak today. Paul, I believe you're going to move the slides on for me, if that's okay.
Very happy to.
Thank you. Can you move to the first slide, please? Thank you. I work in the scientific unit of the National Parks and Wildlife Service for the Irish Government, and I'm going to present some of the concepts we are developing with the landscape. Firstly, let me turn to peatlands in Ireland, and if you can move to the next slide, please. So Ireland is situated on the western fringes of Europe and has a relatively wet climate. We have a very high proportion of peat soils covering approximately 20% of the terrestrial surface. And the main peatland habitats in Ireland are illustrated on this map. The red and blue blanket bogs are most prolific across the uplands along the western seaboard, and the yellow raised bogs occupy the Midland Basin. Ireland holds most of Europe's raised bog resource, but only about 1% of it is actively peat forming due to large-scale industrial extraction coupled with ongoing domestic extraction. Mechanized and domestic extraction also occurs on blanket bogs, and large areas have suffered from overgrazing and non-native conifer plantations. Next slide, please. As we all know, degraded peatlands, their ability to sequester carbon, regulate water and harbour biodiversity. In fact, these degraded systems emit CO2. When peatland emissions will be factored into our national inventories, they will probably add a further 5% to our estimates. Restoring peatlands could reduce our national estimates considerably. These figures are continually being refined as we gain further insights into emission factors. Next slide, please. We have obligations under EU directives to conserve and restore our blanket bog and raised bog habitats. Currently, we're using a combination of national and EU funding. We have removed some plantations from peat soils, begun the rehabilitation of post-production peatlands, and have made considerable progress with the raised bog restoration programme. We're also piloting results-based schemes with landowners to improve the quality of the more agricultural peatland habitats. It's been estimated that these conservation measures, although running to tens of millions of euro per annum, only cover about 5 to 10% of what we actually need to restore our peatlands. There has growing interest from the private sector to support peatland restoration in Ireland. And this Peatlands Finance Ireland project spawned from our need to build structures to mobilise blended finance. We know that we needed to think beyond the targeted schemes and build a vision that would bring on board business, landowners and local communities to drive restoration at a landscape scale and work towards achieving our biodiversity, climate, water and just transition targets. With support from the European Investment Bank, Natural Capital Financing Facility and the National Parks and Wildlife Service, we engaged the Landscape Lab and University College Dublin to scope out the concept further. This process, it's in its very early days, started in March of this year. So if you move on to the next slide, please, Paul. So in the first phase, we brought together 47 stakeholders to build a collective vision. It's very, very important to get all of these stakeholders together. And this included government departments, local authority, academic institutions, community organisations, and industry representatives. Next slide, please. Key stakeholders from established business networks were also engaged through a semi-structured interview process. These included stakeholders from the agriculture, forestry, energy, finance, and food and drink sectors. Overall, there is a desire to invest in and buy carbon credits in Ireland and a strong appetite for science-based targets. The need for strong certification and verification of any offsetting is recognised. Companies are willing to engage with local communities, and they are very interested in projects that supply co-benefits such as increased biodiversity, water purification and flood mitigation. Many businesses are preparing themselves for net zero strategies and they are anticipating changes in legislation. So this is all really good news. The willingness from investors is there, funding at the national and EU level is available, but how can the funds be blended? And Mark pointed to different options earlier, but it is very, very tricky to mobilise these funds, get the structures in place and get the money to the local level where it is needed most. These are very complex processes that have to be worked through. Next slide, please. Sorry, the previous slide, I think it skipped on one. Yeah, let's see. So sorry, the previous slide. The vision of the Peatland Finance Ireland has been aligned to that of the National Peatland Strategy, and that is to optimise the social, environmental and economic contribution of peatlands to the well-being of this and future generations. Next slide, please. The next phase of the project will focus on the governance structures and the development of a regulatory system. The project will start with piloting investment cases, including a community focus. This will further inform us about the structures needed to mobilise the funds. I think it's very, very important to work through these pilot cases. The next slide, please. So in summary, Peatlands Finance Ireland is progressing an integrated solution for investing in climate, biodiversity and community. We hope to demonstrate how to combine finance streams to fund solutions across key sectors, operating at a catchment level that can potentially be scaled up to the national level. I was involved in kickstarting the project, but it is important to note that I am coming at this from a biodiversity and conservation perspective. I don't have the expertise in finance or even carbon markets, but I know that to maximise the opportunities for peatland restoration, we need to draw in many, many players. From a government perspective, this may be a slow process. However, I hope that the motivation from the private sector will catalyse momentum. There may be different realities in different countries, different types of investors, different landowner considerations, different government priorities, regulations being developed at different scales. We must also not lose sight of the reality of what is involved in peatland restoration, including the preparation of restoration plans, the involvement of hydrologists, ecologists, engineers, machinery operators, and the requirement for the monitoring and verification of results. But we can still learn from each other, I think, and ultimately we need to restore the damage we have done, and by whatever means possible. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Deirdre, and thank you, Paul. Fascinating to hear your experiences, work in progress as you co-produce these strategies and start to increasingly blend public and finance to achieve those very ambitious goals in Ireland. Fantastic. So Peter Hutchinson from Peatland Action from Nature Scott is going to be talking next with Renee Kirkvliet-Hermans from the IUCN UK Peatland Programme, taking us closer to home. Peter, over to you first.
Thank you, Mark, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. The first thing I've got to check is, can everyone hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
That's great.
Well, that was a problem.
we had a problem this morning. As Mark says, my name's Peter Hutchinson. I'm the Nature Scott Peatland Action Programme Manager. So my role is to try and unravel some of the complexity that we've heard about this afternoon and this morning, and to try and develop a coherent programme of work to actually deliver the restoration we'll need. I'm now trying to share my screen, so everyone cross their fingers.
Fingers.
Okay. Does that say Peatland Action funding restoration in Scotland? Oh, that's brilliant. Okay, what I'm going to talk about for the next sort of five or 6 minutes is the funding model that exists in Scotland, and I'm going to introduce some of the challenges. So it's very similar to the business as usual model that Mark introduced earlier. I wouldn't say we're uncoordinated, but we're maybe not coordinated. We're not joined up. We're not actually doing much blending. So I'm going to then introduce a challenge, and then I'm going to hand over to Renee, who is to help me develop some of the solutions. Okay, first thing is just to introduce the Peatland Action Programme. It's a national programme to restore peatlands in Scotland. It's led by the Scottish Government, and it's delivered in partnership. The main partners are Nature Scott, the government body that I work for to look after nature, with its supporting delivery agents. The two national parks, Cairngorms, Loch Lomond of the Trossachs, Scottish Water, Forestry and Land Scotland. When Peatland Action started out about 9 years ago, it was very much a Nature Scott initiative. It really is important to emphasise now that it's a partnership. Having said that, Nature Scott still has a very key role in Peatland Action, and actually we're managing delivery about 75% of peatland restoration in Scotland. So it's a partnership, but we're a big player. Nature Scott also leads on the horizontal functions. These are the shared services that everyone needs, things like promoting restoration, why do it, developing the standards, and monitoring actually delivery. So we've got that role as well. The funding model is about supporting both revenue and capital works. The revenue funds cover the costs of the people who will communicate the benefits of peatland restoration. They will provide advice on techniques. They will undertake the surveys and feasibility studies, and very much design the pipeline of projects that we need. So that's the revenue costs. And then the capital costs, that's the cost of the restoration works themselves. And we're operating at a 100% grant at the moment to try and provide full cost recovery. The outputs from this funding model have been pretty impressive. Since 2012, we've delivered over 30,000 hectares of peatland restoration on the road to recovery. We spent about £40 million, and we've had a gradual increase over the years. But as you heard this morning, or many people will have heard this morning, the government has committed to a step change in that. So what we want to do is deliver 250,000 hectares over the next 9 years, and we've got £250 million through the Infrastructure Investment Fund to do this. So what we're talking about here is a 10 times increase in funding for peatland restoration over the next 10 years. How are we going to do that? Sorry, just getting my notes. Well, how are we going to do that? Well, first thing is we really need a step change. We need to develop an investable pipeline of projects. And to get that pipeline, we need to expand and upskill the advisors and the contractors who are going to do this work. And it's important to emphasize that it's both the designers and those who are going to do the delivery on the ground, the diggers. So I often use the phrase, the 2 Ds going forward. We need designers and we need diggers. We also need to motivate land managers. And, it's been touched on a bit. There's a bit of suspicion out there. We need to actually be clear on the benefits. We need to be clear on the funding and actually get that confidence within the land management community. And we also need to smooth the process of getting the money to the land managers so that they can actually feel comfortable and actually manage themselves or have restoration managed on the land. And again, this was mentioned this morning, if anyone was at a presentation. We've got quite a clunky process at the moment. We need to smooth it out. Having said that, we are dealing with a considerable amount of public money, so we have to have some checks in that system. And whilst we're actually undertaking this investment, we also need to prevent the problem getting worse. And that was also announced by the Minister this morning, the importance of protecting the existing peatlands and, through mechanisms like the National Planning Framework, we hope to actually influence development so that we don't make our problem any bigger. Okay, if you look at this graph, this sort of illustrates the challenge going forward. If I can take you to the bottom left of the graph, that actually shows where we're at in terms of peatland restoration. I think we've done a great job, but you can see we're still very low down there. The grey area is what we hope to actually deliver through the infrastructure investment plan, the additional £250 million to deliver 250,000 hectares of peat. So that is a step change. But what we need to do is to move into the purple area of the model. And that's the transformational change that we need and why we need to actually think about a blended finance approach. Because to actually deliver the 1.8 million hectares that we need to restore in Scotland, we estimate that we're going to need in the region of £2 billion. My final slide is how are we going to actually fill that gap? We need to we need to be able to finance the capital works for that expanded delivery. But we also need to be able to provide incentives to the land managers to actually say, you know, these are the benefits of doing restoration on your land. And some of the models that were introduced by Mark earlier in the afternoon are things that we have to explore. And the final point in terms of gaps is that we mustn't lose sight of maintenance. Just like we don't want to make the problem any worse, we actually need to make sure that when we do invest in restoration, we've got the maintenance in place to actually look after it. And that's why Nature Stock now is really looking hard at the blended finance options to try and deliver the transformational change that I think we all have agreed that we need. So at that point, I'm going to now hand over to Renee, who will give an example of a blended finance option for Scotland.
Great, thank you very much for that, Peter. Yes, so my name is Renee Cook-Fleet-Hermans, and I am the Peatland Codes Coordinator for IUCN UK Peatland Programme. So I'll be talking about how we are trying to reduce this investment gap in peatland restoration by bringing in private finance via the Peatland Code, which is our carbon standards. One of the key goals of this COP is obviously to scale up public and private investment into nature, and this is where the Peatland Codes can come in. So the Peatland Code is a domestic voluntary certification standard to attract private funding for peatland restoration projects in exchange for climate benefits by providing assurances to buyers. So it's a project developed and managed by the IUCN UK Peatland Programme. It's UK based, so it's a domestic scheme. It's about emission reductions via peatland restoration. It does not account for the carbon that's already stored in the peatlands, and we have a number of eligibility criteria and a number of legal and financial tests to make sure our projects are additional. Very briefly, you probably all know this by now, but intact peatlands store vast amounts of carbon. They can have meters and meters. They can be meters and meters deep with a lot of carbon stored into them. However, when we degrade them, either via drainage of, like you see on this picture, erosion, we lose a lot of this carbon. So you get vast amounts of greenhouse gas emissions from these degraded peatlands. Currently in the UK, our peatlands, in total, degraded peatlands are actually emitting more carbon than our forests are sequestering every year. So it's a massive issue. Luckily, we can actually stop this. We can restore our peatlands by blocking our drains and revegetating, amongst other things we can do. And actually, this very, very quickly reduces the emissions that are coming off this. So we need to do this, and we need to do this now. So the way the Peatland Code works is that landowners restore their peatlands and they get carbon units in return for that. So this just shows you very broadly how it works. So a project gets registered, they need to do the project design, that gets validated by an independent certification body, and then PIUs, pending issued units, are issued. So these are kind of a promise that emission reduction will happen. It hasn't happened yet, obviously. Then the restoration is carried out. And at year 5 and then every 10 years, we've got a verification done again by the independent certification body. If it's all in order, you then get your PIUs for that chunk of time converted into peatland carbon units. So at that point, we are certain that the emission reduction has happened. So projects can either sell PIUs or the actual verified peatland carbon units, either directly to end users or via a program to end users. End users can only make offset claims on the verified peatland carbon units, and then they need to retire them. So the code is built on best science as used by the government in its greenhouse gas accounting, but still there's definitely a need for more scientific survey and monitoring to expand the code across all peatland restoration situations, including looking at sphagnum sequestration benefits. So this graph shows you the condition categories that are currently under the code, and you can see that even partly improving your peatland condition will result in a permanent annual emission reduction that's then transferred into carbon credits that the landowner can sell. So the Peatland Code follows international standards for voluntary carbon markets, so that's independence and good governance. Real, so we've got ex post after the emission reduction has happened, verification. Measurable, so we've got baseline evidence, we account for leakage in our projects, and the project benefit is measurable. Permanent, so all projects need to do a risk assessment, and we also have a buffer in place for any issues in projects that were outside of the fault of the landowner. Our projects are additional, so we've got a number of tests in place to check for this. They are independently validated and verified, and carbon units are unique, and we've got the transparent registry on IHS Market for that. And our projects should not do any harm. And projects are required to do a consultation, and generally peatland restoration projects have environmental and social benefits. So the code is very much operative and working. So in the last year, we have more than doubled our projects that are registered under the code, and projects are selling PLUs. However, the demand for peatland carbon units is outstripping the supply, and the urgency to restore our peatlands is obviously really, really high. So we have some challenges to upscale this, and I'm also proposing a few solutions here, but welcome any comments on this. So we need to obviously raise awareness amongst land managers and create a pipeline of projects. A key barrier that we've heard about from landowners is a concern about not making enough income if there's, for example, a risk of losing agricultural subsidy by re-retting land. So as Peter just explained, we allow blending of private and public finance. So Peatland Action and Peatland Code in Scotland work really, really well. And also in other devolved countries in the UK, we are working with getting that system working, the blended finance system working better. We are at the moment exploring a carbon guarantee with government. So Mark explains about this a bit more. So that's about setting a floor price and getting landowners to get more confidence into the market and what they would achieve from that sales of carbon. And we also, like Peter just touched upon, we need to definitely increase our contractor capacity on the ground, and also project designers as well. Further, upscaling for investors. So Paul has touched on that the big investors are not interested in really small projects. They need big projects, but the nature of peatland restoration projects is that they are quite small. So we need to aggregate projects on landscape level to make this more interesting for big investors. So we could combine peatland restoration with woodland creation and potentially other natural capital markers as well, for example, biodiversity. So another challenge that we are facing is that we are about avoided emissions and not sequestration. So obviously there are guidelines coming out, for example, Science-Based Target Initiative, that net zero can only be reached if you offset using carbon credits that are taking carbon out of the atmosphere, not avoided emissions. However, as explained, our peatlands are degraded and are emitting vast amounts. That's not going to stop if we're not restoring them, and the public investment is not big enough to actually stop this. So we need private investment into our peatlands to stop them emitting. So the UK government fully accepts this, and they do accept peatland carbon units for offsetting in their environmental reporting guidelines. Another big one I'm just really quickly going to touch upon is obviously the Article 6 negotiations that are ongoing at the moment about corresponding adjustments, which could result in quite big difficulties for a domestic carbon scheme like the Peatland Code. Happy to talk about that more if anybody wants to later on. Very quickly, I don't think this will be enough for the challenge. The challenge is massive. So we very much need more Peatland Code projects, obviously, but I think we also need to look further than carbon, for example, or the natural capital markets as biodiversity, water quality as well, for example. And if anybody knows of any other options, I am all ears and would very much appreciate any discussion around that. So thanks very much for listening. Here are mine and Peter Hutchinson's contact details. If anybody wants to get in touch with us, please do. Thanks very much.
Fantastic, fascinating. Again, just hearing how far advanced this is already. So we will be watching this space with great interest. First questions are coming in. Please do keep those questions coming as we move on. We're going to hear next from Neil O'Brolcon from Peat and National University of Ireland in Galway. Sorry. Neil, over to you. Let's hear about some of the exciting work you've been doing across Europe to develop eco-credits.
Great. Can you hear me okay, Mark?
Yes.
Excellent, excellent. So I'll try to share the screen shortly, but I have to commend you on your pronunciation now. You've worked hard at that and you got my name pretty good, so thank you very much. And also just to say, it's a great honor to be here at COP26 and to speak after such a, I mean, really, really enjoyable and fantastic presentations, because the Peat project is a project in Northwest Europe. And what we have done is, why I'm here speaking to you today really is because we've put together a white paper on carbon and eco-credits with the CONETS project. Valentina Sesci is involved in that, so I want to, acknowledge that. So 2 European projects based in the Northwest region of Europe. And, really our research has shown that in fact the #1 barrier really to wide-scale restoration is access to finance. So it's not necessarily, I mean, as Paul wonderfully pointed out, it's not necessarily the fact that there isn't finance there. Of course there is. It's just that we need to make sure that it's easily accessible to people in a way that's not overly complex. So I'll share my slides and we'll get going with the presentation. Can you see that okay?
Yes. Thank you.
Yeah. Sorry for the complexity of that slide, but we'll move on from it. Okay, I need to, move into my slides so I can start presenting them. Sorry. Click on it. Okay, we can move on. Okay, so this is what we're just briefly discussing in the presentation today, just an outline of the white paper, just a quick look at carbon credit systems, additional incentives, a framework to support rewetting and peatland restoration, and then our conclusions. And I'll try to be as quick as I possibly can. Okay, so the white paper, you can see Northwest Europe, a map of Northwest Europe there. So that's a region within the European Union. It's nice to see that at the moment the UK is involved in that. Unfortunately, that's not going to be the case for much longer, but nevertheless, we hope to have very strong relationships with the UK, and hopefully we'll find a way around that. It's parts of France, parts of Germany, but our partners include Netherlands, Belgium, France, and the UK and Ireland. So basically, the white paper aims to provide a baseline document, an outline of a framework to support rewetting and peatland restoration. And just a quick little, a silly little story here. What are carbon credits? A lot of people don't really understand what a carbon credit is, and we'll get on to sort of the more detailed aspect in a minute. But a typical example of a voluntary carbon credit might be that, a farmer decides to rewet their peatlands, they get approved for carbon credits, while at the same time a family is going on holidays. They make a contribution to, as part of their airline price, towards towards carbon offsetting, and that money then goes back to the farmer. Now there are many other ways of doing this. There's many industrial ways of doing this, but that's just a particular example. So many people have an issue with this, and they say that we're supporting things which shouldn't be happening, we should not be flying and this sort of thing. But I mean, while this is happening, it is a method of providing a certain level of finance. So carbon credit is a unit of measurement. 1 ton of CO2 equivalent removed from the atmosphere effectively. And there are a number of different greenhouse gases involved in that. So the buyer is to offset greenhouse gas emissions and the seller to finance the changes needed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So the two main types of carbon credit system would be the mandatory trade system, and this is very much a government system. National approval from project participants is required. Registration and verification process comes from the UNFCCC, and I hope I got enough C's in that. The voluntary system, which I think is more interesting from a peatland point of view, it basically has no established rules, and it's very project specific. And again, 1 ton of CO2 or CO2 equivalent is equal to 1 ton of carbon. So based on standards, there's a number of different standards around. It's hugely important that standards be applied, and the two that we have particularly focused on would be the gold standard, which is really, I suppose, the top quality standard, and the verified carbon standard, which we felt is actually probably slightly more suited to peatlands, because there are some issues with standards, and one of the issues is that if it's far too costly for landowners, to match up to standards, it means that projects become unviable. So we looked at three different schemes, particularly in relation to carbon credits, and more futures in Germany will be one that's very well known to many of our listeners. And hello to everybody in the virtual world as well. Sorry, I neglected to say that. So the first carbon credits really, I suppose, were issued for rewetting under this scheme. Certificates were issued for reduced greenhouse gas emissions, or indeed for increased sequestration. The certificates were validated by academic experts, and no credits were issued for stored carbon stocks, which has been alluded to by a number of other people here. We'll get onto an issue that we have raised in that regard. And they're currently sold in 3 German federal states. So they've taken very much a regional approach, which I think is very, very interesting. And it's something that everybody should consider, because obviously peatlands and the type of peatlands we're dealing with very much vary depending on the region. And in Deirdre's presentation early, she clearly outlined, the raised bog section of the centre of Ireland, and then the blanket bogs along the west coast. So they're different types of peatland. So they used what they call the guest methodology, and it's certainly something that we feel is hugely important. It's based on the VCS, and the guest methodology, ST, stands for site types. So basically what it does is it looks at measuring a specific site type, identifying other peatlands which are of the same site type, and it's not necessary to measure everyone with the same rigor. It's basically that we would use the expert approach in relation to other site types. So we looked at the Dutch Volta-Verveen, and I hope I got that right for any Dutch people listening. Their system compensates the farmer for rewetting with the issue of certificates. Certificates are validated by national authorities, the national carbon market. I'm not going to go into the Dutch of that, but the certificates are validated by the national authorities based on water levels. So that's a particularly Dutch solution, but it's a very interesting one. And they've managed to sell carbon credits recently at roughly €70 per credit, which is a reasonable amount of money to sell a carbon credit. So the credits can be purchased from, as I said, the National Carbon Market, which is the English version. The Peatland Code, I'm not going to go into that in detail because we just had an excellent presentation from Renee, but basically she outlined everything. So it's administered by the IUCN, and carbon benefits are regularly monitored during the project. And there's a question being raised. They talk about a minimum of 30 years. Greifswald talk about 50 years. But as is pointed out by Professor Hans Houston, who's a well-known person in the peatland community, are we really allowed to go beyond 2050, because we're supposed to hit zero carbon in 2050? So we need to kind of think about that and how we're going to do this. you know, because that is a really valid question, because the clock is ticking. And if we're talking about 30 years, we're now at 29 if we're going to stop these projects to 2050. Now, a thing that we have identified, and I alluded to it earlier, is what we call the paradox of additionality. And that, I hope I've spelt it correctly now. But just the point about that is peatland destruction is rewarded by additionality in many cases, and conservation is not rewarded. So we get a situation where landowner A has conserved their land in a very good state. Landowner B has made a lot of money out of basically ripping up their peatland, and now they get rewarded by carbon credits for putting it back into pristine condition. But the problem is that the guy who you know, has kept it in pristine condition said, well, where's my money? You know, and the answer to that is, well, sorry, you know, you're a great guy, but you're not going to be rewarded for that. So then he might say, well, hang on a second, I better rip up my land and then look for some money. And unfortunately, we did find that happened in schemes like REPS in the European Union, that people ripped out hedgerows in order to put them back. So I know that's not what many people do. It's maybe an extreme example, but it's just something we need to think about and be aware of. So just quickly, the blue credits are, as we've defined them, are basically water-based credits. And when you talk about blended finance, it's also possible to look at the payment within the schemes of water-based credits as well as carbon credits. So what we actually looked at incorporating you know, ecosystem services into carbon credit system, or creating a separate system. Now, there are already payments in some countries, including the Netherlands, for you know, for keeping peatlands in a particular state in relation to water, but they don't work with the carbon credit system necessarily. So our view is certainly it makes far more sense from a market point of view to look at incorporating ecosystem services into a carbon credit scheme, to look at an added value situation, you know, for that type of credit. So that's the framework we put together in graphical format towards an integrated eco-credit system for the EU. And we'd hope that the UK, who's very much involved in this process and this project, you know, is very much going to mirror that, and that other European countries, and perhaps even other countries around the world, will look at the work we're doing in this regard. So I just was very encouraged recently with the comments of Executive Vice President of the European Commission, Frans Timmermans, when he said that in the next years we will protect wetlands and peatlands, dedicate more farmland to biodiversity, boost organic farming, open up new income sources for farmers via carbon farming, and begin to redress inequalities in the distribution of income support. So the EU is very much behind the sort of initiatives we're talking about today. And indeed, a lot of work is being done in that regard, particularly in relation to the CAP. We've very much been involved in discussions around the CAP with the European Commission and others. And to be honest with you, there is a huge positive view in that regard. Now, there is obviously a bit of a, I suppose, friction between DG Agri and DG Envy, so the agricultural side of things and the you know, the environment side. But nevertheless, it is coming to a conclusion, and very much the Green Deal is very much to the fore. So we had a little look, we had an analysis of the various different countries involved in the scheme, including Germany. 6 different countries looked at, and what we concluded from this, that at the moment farming in the EU is heavily subsidized, and indeed some types of farming without subsidies are simply not viable, and that's the reality. And if carbon farming, and there is to be an announcement soon in the EU about a carbon farming initiative, if carbon farming is to take place, we feel that this should be looked at, and we're suggesting that subsidy equalization for carbon farming should very much be put in place. Now, in some cases, this would be very much revenue neutral, that if you're moving, for example, from sheep and goat farming to carbon farming, you know, that you're just swapping one subsidy for an existing subsidy. But in the case we're talking about bringing in new lands, you know, for carbon farming, It's obviously going to be more costly, but there is a lot of money allocated in the Green New Deal, and hopefully this is going to be sufficient. So just conclusions. The current systems do not effectively support peatland restoration. We concluded that international standards are too expensive for small peatland projects, and that's quite important, especially in countries like Ireland, where a lot of the projects by definition will be small, probably the same in Scotland and Poland and various other EU countries, whereas some countries, large projects are, Germany, I think, has a lot of very large peatland farms and so on. At the moment, there are very few examples of successful projects, and I think Renee again was calling for more projects. I think that's going to soon be remedied by a lot more projects that are coming on stream, and we very much encourage everybody to get behind those projects. An easy and cheap accreditation system is needed. We're suggesting that something along the lines of the guest model is important, and we need to make sure that the systems which put in place are not too bureaucratic or not too difficult for people to access. And I think when it comes to sort of national schemes, there's a real danger of that. So I think when we're looking at schemes, it's very important, as various people have said, that stakeholders are consulted at every step of the way, and to make sure that it is actually something which is accessible to people. So examples show that the sale of peatland carbon credits is absolutely realistic. It's something that we feel is going to happen in a very large way in the future. People don't realize that peatlands are, they hold about 4 times as much carbon per hectare as tropical rainforests, for example. I mean, there is, we're talking about roughly, sums of about 5% of the global emissions will come from degraded peatlands, and roughly 5% of emissions, 5 to 6% in the European Union. Now that figure does include the UK. I would say immediately, I think it might be around 5% if you exclude the UK. Common standards and guidelines for carbon credits and ecosystem services are urgently needed across countries. And the reason that's hugely important is we do see this business of leakage, where, for example, in Ireland, which we heard, 20% roughly, 1/5 of the land area is peatland. We started importing peat from Latvia because of regulations. It's absolute nonsense, this sort of thing. But there's no point in us saving peat in Germany because of regulations, or the UK, and then importing it from another country, because that actually makes the situation worse from a climate point of view rather than better. And finally, the equalization of subsidies. We feel that from a farming point of view, the equalization of subsidies for peatland restoration and maintenance is required. That's very much up to the powers that be to decide on, but realistically, it's grossly unfair to expect people to do carbon farming with their hands tied behind their back. So, it is hugely important that we get the whole landscape right, as it were. So that concludes my talk anyway, but really I just think that this is probably amongst the most important areas of discussion in relation to unblocking wide-scale research. And I also do feel that peatlands are something that really, it is a low-hanging fruit. Restoration of peatlands is a low-hanging fruit, very much in terms of the reducing carbon emissions in Europe and indeed around the world. So I really commend everybody involved in this initiative, the Peatland Pavilion here, and delighted to be able to talk to you today. So thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed. So we're going to move to questions now. Already a question I've never been able to answer come for you, Neil, maybe for all of us, on how do we overcome the paradox of additionality and reward people for good practice. But I'm going to start, if I may, with Paul. So a couple of related questions for you, Paul. Is there a danger that green bonds and other finance mechanisms that you mentioned overburden landscapes and communities with debt? And how do you ensure local communities benefit from green investments? So what have been some of the benefits, for example, of the DRC Red Plus project that you spoke about?
Well, green bonds are fully commercial loans, so banks aren't going to give them unless they have a fairly good chance that the money will get returned. I don't think there's going to be I would hope we don't get into a situation where we get flooded, communities flooded with debt. That's a very long way off. What is true is that debt has destroyed the environment. It's paid for the equipment to remove forests, to dam waterways, to take out peatlands and so on. And so it's an acceleration instrument for activities. So how can we use that acceleration instrument in the opposite direction to restore peatlands? And exactly what Rene was saying, we've got a few projects that are now starting to happen and get money in, which is benefiting those farmers and other communities. How can we accelerate that with debt? Because it costs money to build those projects up front. How can we use a loan from the future funds that are going to come in from those carbon credits to pay for getting a whole lot more of those projects rolling out through the landscape? I think that's the exciting opportunity we have ahead of ourselves as we build blended finance instruments.
Brilliant, thank you, Paul. So, Deirdre, you've spoken to a range of different stakeholders. We saw some of them on the screen earlier on, and I wonder, based on those workshops, what's the kind of the range of reactions that you're getting to the prospect of you trying to leverage, as you described, more private finance into peatlands in Ireland?
Yeah, it was quite positive. I think Ireland is a mixture of small landholders and then the forestry and peat extraction semi-state bodies. So from the more small landholder perspective, I think there was they really wanted to make sure that people were at the heart of peatland restoration, and that any governance should be cross-agency, cross-body, with a bottom-up approach that supported a just transition. So my hope really is that local communities will seize the opportunities and come together and maybe form some kind of cooperative or land trusts to avail of funds, to try and get the funding back down to the local level, to the landowner, and that they can be part of the solution.
Yeah, interesting approach. I like. So getting practical now for Peter, someone's saying, I'm aware that limited contracting capacity is currently a limiting factor in delivering peatland restoration in Scotland. What measures, if any, are being put in place to rectify this?
Okay, thanks, Mark. That's a very real challenge we've got at the moment, and we're struggling to get contractors to undertake feasibility studies and surveys. To try and address that, what we're trying to do is provide certainty on projects, or certainty on projects over a number of years. So contractors could actually see, if I invest in somebody, there is going to be work for a number of years. So it's providing that certainty for contractors to actually invest. The other thing that we're doing, though, is also developing training of contractors, just so that we can support the quality of contractor capacity that we're looking for as well. So it's providing certainty and providing training.
Yeah, fantastic. Okay, good. And fingers crossed that will work. It's what a shame. We've got all of this money and an opportunity, but without the contractors, we're not going to get very far. Rene, a tricky question for you. How can the Peatland Code be replicated in other countries? Who are the main stakeholders you'd have to involve? And what would be the biggest challenge of implementing these types of standards in countries from the global south?
Thanks. That is a really good question. It's actually a question we've been trying to address recently in Ireland with Paul and Deirdre as well. So actually the code itself, the standards, you can take and apply it somewhere else. The very, very difficult thing is you need scientific data to back up your emission factors. So that is in a lot of places the issue that is going to stop to stop a peatland code as we have it in the UK from working. Another one that you need to think about is you need a host organization that is independent. You need to have good governance in place behind it, so that you're credible as the standards set. Yeah, and you need a transparent registry. So those things are overcomable, but yeah, the emission factors and the science are the tricky ones.
Yeah, I can imagine. Paul, you've done quite a lot of work in the developing world. So anything you want to add to that?
Well, I mean, Renee and I are heading up to the Flow Country on Monday to have a look at exactly this question. I think there's also that question of getting commercial finance in. You know, how do you get early finance in for getting many more projects? Often we look at carbon payments as payments. You know, they just come into farmers or landowners or whatever. But can we look at them as equity to start new businesses or expand existing businesses so that you scale the system further? And can we also design in, and this is what we're looking at in Ireland, but also Scotland, can we design in payments for other services, biodiversity services, ICL certified production, sustainable production, water supply, and so on, so that one system can benefit multiple products, multiple environmental products. I'm having dinner tonight with Gold Standard CEO and her team, and they're doing really exciting work in creating a multiple standard system.
Brilliant. Thank you, Paul. Finally, to Neil. I'm not going to put you on the spot and ask you to answer the question about the additionality paradox, because I can't answer it, but be my guest if you've got the solution to that one. The question that I'd like to put to you is, what do you think of the double counting issue? So once in national inventories, secondly by the private buyer for compensation.
Yeah, well, it regularly comes up, and I think sometimes it's a little bit overblown, because the key thing is to get our systems right. And we're now involved in a new project in Europe to to look at the data from, try to link together data from different peatlands right across the continent, and to make sure that the existing systems are very much open in the way that they're looked at. And it's possible to, of course it's possible to look at this in a way that we make sure that this doesn't happen. But to be honest with you, my point of view would be, we need to restore peatlands quite urgently, because I mean, we're talking about the planet here. And if we're going to get hung up on something which happens on a very irregular basis and overblow it, I think it's just a bad idea. I mean, I think what we've got to do is police it properly, but really we need to get ahead with rewetting. We need to get ahead with restoration, and we need to make sure that this doesn't happen, because it is a negative thing. But if we get the correct systems in place, it can't happen. So that's really my answer to it.
Fantastic. So we need these high integrity markets with those systems in place. Of course, there's a related issue. Our negotiators are currently talking about corresponding adjustments, looking at whether that should apply to domestic and voluntary carbon markets as well. So we shall wait with bated breath to see what happens on that part of the Article 6 negotiations. It has been a pleasure. I really appreciate all of you for putting your effort in and time. Thank you, Neil, Peter, Paul, Renee, and Deirdre. Thank you everyone for tuning in, and enjoy the rest of your day.